This is Free to Exchange, the show where free markets and free-thinking scholars meet. I'm your host, Ben Powell. West Texas is by far the windiest place I've ever lived. I've seen more huge white wind turbines since I moved here than I had seen in my entire life prior to coming to Tech 6 years ago. Are these turbines a good idea? Do they improve the environment? Are they good for the United States economy? Texas's economy? If so, should taxpayers subsidize them? These are some of the questions I'm going to explore with my guests on the show today. My first guest is Dr. Andrew Swift. Dr. Swift is a professor of civil and environmental engineering here at Texas Tech, where he also serves as the associate director of the National Wind Institute. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
So, just briefly, as associate director of the National Wind Institute, what do you do here? What's your program?
Right, so we have a wind energy education program. We have about 200 student majors. We report to the associate vice provost, Patrick Hughes, and we're placing about 80% of our students in the renewable power industry right now. So it's exciting.
So that is a big program here and kind of a unique one, and of course being in West Texas may be fitting. Can you tell me more broadly, why wind energy in particular? What's the importance of getting our electrical power from wind?
Right. So it's an abundant source of energy. It's domestic. It's local. It helps the local economy. It's also global. I mean, I'm going to call it an explosion of renewable energy across the globe is huge. Many countries are doing it because of the security it provides, the diversity of fuel source to help diversify their electric supply. So and there's some huge environmental benefits. We'll be getting into those, I'm sure, as we move on here.
So, sure, briefly then, actually as a follow-up, because I mean, we can get energy from lots of things, so the kind of why wind in particular, I think a lot of people would think about the environment.
Right. So there's no combustion. The fuel is delivered free, so you don't have to mine something or put it in a pipeline and deliver it. The fuel comes to you. So you essentially erect the turbine and directly make electrons to put on the grid, and that's your product, which you're going to sell. So that's the business. A couple of the big
Sure. It's not free because we have to still build the turbine, and that costs money and resources to do that too.
I don't think I said the electricity was free. I said
the source
the wind,
once it's built.
Right, the wind is free.
Okay.
But certainly, you're absolutely right. These are very expensive pieces of equipment, and you have to do that conversion. So thanks for catching me on that.
So, and I don't think I really caught you. I just wanted to elaborate for everybody on that. So, a lot of the debate around it isn't so much of should we use wind for energy. I think everybody recognizes it. In fact, throughout history, people have used wind for energy, whether it's sailboats or things farther from the grid or stuff like that. It's should government policy encourage wind energy in particular, but any type of energy, I guess, in particular?
Well, that's a real good question. I'm kind of a free market person myself. However, I think if you look at energy sources, almost every single energy source has been subsidized. It's part of our modern economy, from oil and gas to wind. A lot of people think there's a kind of conflict between wind and oil and gas. It's one or the other. In the electricity industry, I see it as diversification, just like a stock portfolio. You don't want all your eggs in one basket. And so you want to diversify. And I think wind and solar, renewables, let's just call it that, add good diversity to the mix that we already have of fossil fuels, nuclear, and
And I think it is a fair point about subsidies across different industries as well. And, in particular, let's get into some of the ones in wind and energy in particular then. So at the federal level is the federal production credits, I believe they're called. What are those and how do they work?
It's a tax, it's a tax credit. Okay, so it's not a direct subsidy. You have to have a tax appetite, and you have to produce something to get the production tax credit and deliver it to the grid. And then you can take a tax credit on that amount that you produced. So it is an incentive. There is no doubt. It's been helping to drive down the cost. I think at this point there's enough wind on the grid. Well, I'm sure we'll talk about that later. It's causing maybe some little bit of dark market disruption, but it certainly was one of the key things. It's done. It's Congress. You're going to go lobby tomorrow. It's already done. Like 2020, it's phased out, so it's decreasing to zero. So I think people have recognized it had a good use to get things started, but maybe it's outlived its usefulness.
All right. At the state level, then, the major way that, or at least my understanding, I'm not a wind or energy expert here, is that it's the renewable portfolio standards. More than half states have some form of renewable portfolio standard. Can you say what those are and how it interacts particularly with Texas energy and Texas wind?
Sure. The Texas example, as I understand it, and I'm not an economist, I'm trained as an engineer, but you get into this, you begin to learn. I mean, the Texas economy, they did a study in about the late 90s, early 2000s of Texans, and they were highly in favor of wind and renewables. So the state, the utilities began to say this might be a good thing for the state. And Senate Bill 5 in 2005 put in a portfolio standard for a few thousand, I can't remember the exact number now, megawatts of wind to help get it going in the state, mandate utilities to actually have part of their portfolio in renewables. And Texas hit that way ahead of time. I mean, we just blew through that like nothing. But that's why states do it. It's an incentive to add renewables to the portfolio in the state.
But in Texas's case now, we're so far past it that it's no longer a binding commitment?
As I understand it, I don't follow the latest legislation. Maybe some of your other guests may be able to add a little more, but I do know about Senate Bill 5 back in 2005.
All right, so and at the local level too, there's a tax abatement program of some sort here in Texas where jurisdictions can give up in exchange. What's that?
Sure. There's a huge benefit from it. There's a lot of poor school districts that have benefited from that. What it is if a wind farm, wind business wants to come in and be in a local community, they go to the board and say, this is a huge capital investment. It's going to be a huge taxing entity for you. We'd like an abatement in order to come for several years, and then we'll pick up. So a lot of the school districts have given that abatement to attract the businesses there. I think without the abatement, a lot of those businesses wouldn't happen. So
it's like a lot of local development incentives that they
like
give a tax
a lot
exception.
of local developments. Yes, sir.
So in the kind of last minute that we have here in this segment, can you tell me a little bit, what do you see as the future for wind energy, whether via government policy or just the technology changing? How do you see it evolving?
Yes, it's growing very, very quickly still globally. I mentioned that. The new nuance, if you will, is corporate industrial. For example, in Texas, there's a GM plant in Arlington that is getting 100% renewable. I'm sure we'll get into the details of how that works later, but companies want to show their environmental friendliness. They feel it's good business, and so this gives them a way to do that.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We'll have you back in just a few minutes to discuss this more with my next guest.
Look forward to it.
My next guest isn't blown away by the economics of wind energy. In fact, he's pretty critical of it. Stick around to hear his views next.
This program is made possible in part by a grant from the Helen Jones Foundation, supporting education and the fine arts in keeping with the philosophy of Helen DeVitt Jones, who devoted her later life to sharing her wealth as a patron of philanthropic causes. The Helen Jones Foundation.
Welcome back. Joining me now is Cutter Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez is the Energy Project Campaign Manager and Policy Analyst with the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Cutter, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
So let's start with just the wind energy in general. I kind of started with the first guest of why he thinks it's a good idea. Let me start with you. What do you think of wind energy in general as a good idea, or the problems that you see with it?
I think there's some need for a diverse energy portfolio, like we've already heard, of course. But wind poses unique problems when it comes to reliability. For example, it peaks at around 1 to 3 a.m., and that's when our demand is at its lowest, when the ERCOT, the Energy Reliability Council's grid, is needing the least energy. And those kind of things need to play into our policy decisions when we approach the creation of this diverse portfolio.
Yeah, so the wind doesn't necessarily blow during the hottest part of the day when we're using the most power here in Texas, but
right.
Is that really a problem if people aren't saying we need 100% wind? Why can't, if 10% or 20% comes from wind, the other stuff make up the difference?
It matters because that affects the pricing scheme. So what we see in some cases is that when wind surges in the middle of the night, prices are artificially pushed down below zero. So they're actually negative prices where wind producers are paying people to take money from the grid just to move those electrons, right? And what that does is it pushes off the baseload producers that have to keep things running so that when wind doesn't show, we have energy.
What do you mean it pushes them off? Do you mean we're getting less baseline producers at other times of the day because they can't meet their fixed costs or something?
Because the economics of it just doesn't work out, because a nuclear plant, a natural gas source, those things can't afford to pay people to take their energy, right? They don't have the massive surge at those non-peak hours where the pricing scheme works out that way.
Okay, I'm not sure I actually understand the problem correctly here yet. No one's forcing them to, though, right? So if they don't have to pay people to take their energy, what's the problem?
Right. Well, because when ERCOT manages the grid, renewable sources are given prime picking, right? So they're the first ones to be taken. We have to take those no matter what. And to be competitive, because you can't turn off a nuclear plant,
Right.
for example, they have to keep running through those hours. And they're having to run at an uneconomical price for their product. And so that threatens the baseload because fewer people are able to function in that time period.
And provide the base load that's
Provide the baseload that's needed, especially when we reach the afternoon hours. When we hit 5 p.m., and a couple weeks ago we hit those massive loads, and it was kind of questionable whether or not we'd have the power to do it without some kind of outage.
So I think I get what it is. Because of this, because of the pricing on the margin of these ones, it prevents some entry into the baseline production, so we have a lower
Right.
baseline than we would otherwise.
Correct.
Okay. Now let's turn to the issue of policy more rather than the economics of that by itself. First guest talked about some various subsidies. What do you think about, I guess the federal subsidies are being phased out, but the other various subsidies that are being given to wind energy in particular?
Yeah, well, and it's important to note first that even the federal subsidies only phase out if Congress lets them. And there's a strong appetite, as we know, for environmental protection and other arguments that might incentivize Congress to keep them in place.
Fair enough.
In Texas, we have a variety of systems. You mentioned the renewable portfolio standard, and that's still in place. So a certain percentage of our energy has to come from renewables. And then there's also Chapter 312 and 313 agreements, in which local governments can abate taxes for these developers to get that in their territory, in their geographic area. And this poses a number of problems. First off, what I've seen when I've been in these communities, when I've been in Comanche, when I've been in Matagorda and Bay City, what it does is it pits neighbor against neighbor. And I think we underestimate that when the state kind of offloads this decision onto the local governments, because these negotiations are behind closed doors. They're exempt from open meetings and exempt from public information in Texas. So citizens don't know about them until probably 72 hours before it's time to make comment. And we know that that's not enough time to prepare the research about the project itself, when you can get details there, to make an adequate public comment and influence the decision when the negotiations have already taken place.
Well, what's the debate or the negotiation? As my first guest was describing it, it sounds like they come in, build something that wasn't there.
Right.
They don't pay taxes for a little while, and then they start paying taxes afterwards.
Yeah. Well, and the debate is about a number of things, depending on who you ask. Some people in the community just don't want it near them. Some people experience, sleepless nights, anxiety, whatever else, at the siting that is where the windmill is located.
Right, the not in my backyard syndrome.
Right. And at the foundation, we take a kind of economic standpoint. And so when you transcend kind of the local level, we see the impacts on the grid, and we ask, should the state be subsidizing something that doesn't provide reliable electricity? And some people will say it's predictable. Yes, it is. We know that it's going to peak during our minimum load and be at the bottom when it's our maximum load. Predictable, yes. Reliable, no. And it gives local governments control over those statewide policy decisions.
So let me ask a question inspired by my first guest's comments. He pointed out, I think rightly, that other forms of energy get subsidized too. Are these subsidies to wind just equating to the same type of subsidy that another form of energy gets? Or is it disproportional? Does it distort the market?
I would
Does
say
it distort or even it out?
Disproportionate, definitely. Now, ideally, we could end all subsidies, right? That's our thing. Where I come from and where my employer comes from is that if you want to build it, okay, but don't use taxpayer funds or special deals to do so. Wind, however, does receive different levels of subsidy. The production tax credit alone, between now and when it phases out, if it phases out, is going to cost another $48 billion in tax revenues, right? And then that's not counting the local level costs. The comptroller a few years back did a study of Chapter 313 agreements to see how much it costs to bring jobs in, because that was the goal, was jobs creation, right?
Oh, don't do that to me here. I hate this job creation.
No, I know,
stuff.
I know.
Jobs are a cost, not a benefit.
Right. But that was the argument, right, before the Texas legislature. And the cost to create that job is what they found was around $300,000. And these are for jobs that are usually around $50,000 per year.
Right, but the benefit is the energy. So if the subsidy is only creating the equivalent amount of energy as a subsidy to oil, gas, whatever, then it's a wash. Forget this jobs crap. Let's not talk about jobs. So is it disproportional, and is it unjustly disproportional? So let me throw this one at you. I could imagine someone saying, well, wind deserves a bigger subsidy than, say, oil, because wind doesn't have carbon emissions. Carbon emissions contribute to global warming. That's a classic spillover cost in economics. So is there a justification for the subsidies on that margin, or are they still too big?
I think they're still too big when we look at them in light of the things like reliability, right? It's all well and good to consider those things. And we should look at how we're purchasing our energy on the consumer level and where it's coming from, right? But at a statewide level, ERCOT's job is to make sure we have energy to turn on the lights. At the end of the day, if the state is incentivizing something that jeopardizes that, then it's counter to our mission and counter to the state of Texas' job in that process.
So what I'm hearing from you is a lot of this comes back to this grid surging and reliability issue and what it does to baseline.
Certainly, yes.
All right, we're going to have you right back, but we're bringing back our other guests too, and we're going to continue this discussion.
Awesome.
Stick around.
Free to Exchange is a joint project of Texas Tech's Free Market Institute and Texas Tech Public Media. More information is available at fmi.ttu.edu.
All right, welcome back. Let's continue our discussion here. Let's kind of again start with the pre-government policy stuff and the technicality of how the wind energy and economics works here. Cutter brought up in the last segment the reliability of wind as it doesn't produce when we need power most and how this affects the rest of the grid. Andrew, do you have something to say about that?
Yeah, I think there's some other issues. It's all about keeping the lights on, right? Okay. And wind is an intermittent source, as is solar, the two main renewables. But really, all power plants are intermittent at some level. And you really have to look at grid integration, okay? And I see you saying, well, what do you mean? Well, plants go down for maintenance. Plants go down for all kinds of things. So there's a 24-hour ahead scheduling to keep the lights on. They know about what the power is going to be tomorrow. So they go to forecasters. And I think Cutter said, you can forecast winds. What's the wind going to be at 3 tomorrow afternoon? What's the sun going to be? What nuclear power, what's available to us to meet that load? And if it's available, we put it on. So the grid integrates out a lot of that stuff. Sure, the wind comes up and down. Also, you don't want to use the law of averages. The wind blows sometimes in summer afternoons here, pretty darn strong. On the average, 1 o'clock in the morning, Cutter's right. But I think you need to look at it on a day-to-day basis.
Okay, does that actually cut to the economic point about the pricing and the surge because of the intermittence? How does that work?
I don't think it spoke at all to the point of the baseload producers and the pricing scheme that it forces them to comply with. And that's really, I think, the concern is that in the intermittency of wind, like you're saying, we're relying on other things to be available so that we can integrate the grid that way. And my fear, and I think the research reflects this, is that if wind were to take a greater and greater percentage of our portfolio, that the pricing scheme would push out the people that we're relying on to provide that base load.
Well, the grid's there to make sure the lights are on. ERCOT's in big trouble if the lights aren't on. Yes. And it's kind of hard to see. I understand your point on subsidies, but something that keeps driving the cost down, it's hard to see how that's not good for the customer.
Rightly so, but we got to look beyond just the consumer, because the ratepayer, yes, might see an immediate decline, but we got to look beyond that. So we got to look at where are those costs coming from otherwise, because it's not economical for any business to pay someone to take their product, right? That doesn't make sense of itself. So what happens is the subsidies that make that scheme possible are being paid for by the taxpayer, usually also the ratepayer. So it hides some of those costs in the tax bill so that when you pay for electricity directly, you might not see it. And that's what's the problem, is that it's not quite clear what the cost is because it's all embedded in other things.
Okay, I think this is actually starting to blend the two issues now. Of by doing it this way, is it a disproportionate subsidy in wind that allows negative prices for them that on the margin crowds out baseline producers?
Yeah, I can see, and I think we agreed, and I mentioned it before, but the PTC is being phased out. Cutter pointed out that there might be some question about that, but I think that's
PTC,
a debate.
The
That's a
PTC
debate.
is, again,
It's being phased out.
right. The portfolio tax credit is being phased out.
Production
Yes.
tax credit.
Production tax credit
All right,
is
correct.
being phased out, and that's what I think is his point, has been driving down those costs, because you produce, you get a tax credit. So at zero, I can still make $1 because for every kilowatt hour I put on the grid, I still get some income, whereas the gas plant doesn't. But of course, they're getting their subsidies through depletion allowances, intangible drilling costs, all other kinds of things.
Gotcha. Let's come back to those in 1 second. So as I'm starting to understand this better then. So you mentioned quite rightly that the legislature could renew these in 2020. But if they don't, does this marginal pricing that allows for the negative pricing go away if those tax credits at the federal level go away?
Because the local and state schemes, I'm sure they could still, I'm not sure it'd be quite as severe, because certainly the production tax credit is a hefty subsidy, though indirect, to these wind producers. So it might make it a little more even, but we still have a problem. And that, again, the government's picking winners and losers, and rightly so. When they have subsidies for oil, natural gas, those things, I completely agree they're wrong, and that we should make them play on an even playing field. What I think we're both talking to the point here that it's also distorted by, you're saying depletion credits, things like that, production tax credit, Chapter 313, all these other things, that it's hard to even navigate, and it's certainly hard for the voter, the regular citizen, to make an informed decision on this. And legislators are nothing more than regular citizens, right? So how do we get to the meat of it? And so we have people like me and you who are, experts in these things, right? And what I've seen is that certainly in the current scheme, wind and solar receive a greater benefit.
So I'm all for the even playing field here, and I'd like to see subsidies abolished all over the place. But you saying that wind and solar receive a greater benefit, you could plausibly make a case for why they should receive a greater benefit. Could you?
Yeah, I think the environmental benefit, if you externalize the cost of a coal plant, the amount of water used in a coal plant it's a large number. Wind and solar make electricity without using water. That's a huge deal in West Texas.
As long as they're paying for their water market rates, which God knows in Lubbock is a problem that we don't have the right market rates for water around here. But as long as a coal plant was paying market rates for water, that's not an external cost.
Well, I think market rates are very dependent on whether there's a drought. You go into a time of drought and ask somebody what the value of quantity of water is, and you're going to get very different answers. Yes, it gets set, but I think it's a huge deal throughout the Great Plains. It's our breadbasket. We have to conserve the water that we have. Mm-hmm. And then there's the air pollution issues, and we don't necessarily need to even get into carbon. There's other air pollution issues that come, and so I think there's some issues there that could be used to levelize. Is it fair? Is it the right amount? I don't know. What's the value of a gallon of water? Depends.
So we have the benefit now of having had wind development in pretty large quantities in multiple places, not just Texas, around the world, right? And we can see nations like Germany that have taken very aggressive programs. I think they have the Energiewende, was their program, to go renewable, right? To do that for the environmental argument as well as other things. And what we've seen in Germany is an actual increase at stabilization at best, and actually sometimes increase in carbon emissions. So the environmental argument didn't quite hold up. Whereas the US, which doesn't have a free and completely competitive energy market per se, is a little less aggressively controlled, and we saw a significant reduction in carbon emissions.
Just very briefly, why did carbon emissions go up under this in Germany?
It's for a number of reasons, not the least of which is they actually invested in turn because of reliability issues in things like coal, which burn not so cleanly, whereas the US invested in things like natural gas, which are a significantly cleaner source.
Final thought?
Can I pop in on that one?
Last 30 seconds.
Fukushima, I think, was a huge deal for Germany. As I understand it, not an expert, you may know more, they stopped doing nuclear power, which is carbon clean. And so you have to get it from somewhere. So.
All right. Well, thank you both very much for joining me today.
Okay.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed our discussion today. I think both of our guests made some very valid points. And I think a key one that was brought up by both of them is what a level playing field without subsidies to either renewables or traditional baseline fossil fuel production would look like. A lot of people worry that without subsidies to wind energy or other renewables, we just got to run out of these fossil fuels. And the economics behind that just doesn't make sense. What would happen if we had a level playing field in a free market is as we use up more and more fossil fuels, their prices would start to go up, people would conserve on them more, and the entrepreneurial incentive to move into creating wind, solar, nuclear, and technologies we haven't even thought of yet would increase, and entrepreneurs would move us in that direction when the price signals guided them to, and would never end up running out of those fossil fuels as we slowly and then more rapidly started to switch away from them. If there was an argument for a subsidy, it would have to be based on that there's an external cost to these fossil fuels that's not there for wind and solar and other renewables. The most obvious one would be impacts on CO2 levels that might contribute to global warming. But as a matter of policy here in the United States, the economics on that one tells me we can't do a whole lot with those subsidies anyway. If we give subsidies to wind or solar or any other renewable here in the United States, it would just lower our demand for fossil fuels. But as we lower our demand, that would lower its price. India, China, other developing countries, when the price of them goes down, they would use more. We'd end up with roughly the same amount of CO2 emission around the globe. It would just come from a different spot on the globe. If you want a policy to subsidize Chinese and other developing countries' process of growth, that'd be it. But it wouldn't be a policy for helping the environment based off the spillover cost of global warming. Myself, I'd like to see a free market in energy, getting rid of the subsidies on both sides of these industries. We'll see you next time.